Hello everybody. Okay, so for this review, I'll do a little bit of the judicial branch and bureaucracy and administrative discretion and the budget. And some of the budgetary issues. Alright. So there's another video with a lot of the judicial branch stuff on it. Just a quick looking through a couple of the cases that we did in class to talk about how the judicial branch can influence the other two branches and how they can rule on executive actions and legislation and such. So we talked about the Voting Rights Act, the Affordable Care Act, and the Clean Air Act, and how the judiciary ruled on those issues. So the Voting Rights Act, these are all laws, and some of them, the Voting Rights Act and the Affordable Care Act, had to do the Supreme Court looked at portions of that law. In the Clean Air Act, that decision was with regards to what the executive branch had to do to be in compliance with the law. In the Voting Rights Act, the formula that was used to determine which states had to get the federal government to approve their election law changes because they had a history of racial discrimination. The formula that was used to determine those states and what states qualified to need to meet those the federal government guidelines, it hadn't been updated since 1975. And even though the Senate had gone back, and the Senate and the House had gone back and looked at that formula and looked at that law in 82 and in 96, and both times approved that formula again. You know, they reviewed it, they decided that it still worked and they wanted to keep it that way, so they reauthorized it. The Supreme Court decided that since it hadn't been updated in quite a while, that part of the law was unconstitutional. It was not fair to states. It wasn't good. You'd almost say they said it wasn't good policy, and that in order for that section that looked at which states would be subject to that pre-approval, Congress had to go in there and update that provision. That hasn't happened. It may not look like it'll happen for a while. But the Supreme Court kept the rest of the law in place. And there's still other things in the law, but the main thrust of that Voting Rights Act was that requirement for states to get the federal government to approve their election law changes to make sure they don't discriminate anymore. In the Affordable Care Act, now this is an interesting case because I think it also gets to that the issue of if the Supreme Court will just throw out a piece of a law, or if they'll throw out the entire law as being unconstitutional. So with the Affordable Care Act, the big thing that was at issue, or that was the big ruling in the Affordable Care Act, was on the Medicaid for the states. So the Affordable Care Act said that the states had to expand Medicaid to cover everybody up to 133% of the federal poverty line. States that did not do that would have their Medicaid funding taken away from them, so they would not get any Medicaid funding, and that would be that. There would not be Medicaid in that state. Before the Affordable Care Act, Medicaid was a voluntary program to begin with. The states voluntarily signed up for Medicaid, and it is a still federal government state government partnership where the state governments decide who qualifies for Medicaid, who they want to qualify for Medicaid, and the federal government and the states share the cost of that Medicaid to cover those people. So who qualifies for Medicaid will vary widely between different states. It all depends on how generous that specific state wants to be. The Affordable Care Act was going to change that some. They were going to, like I said, make Medicaid have a nationwide mandatory sort of threshold. Any state could go over that if they wanted to, 133%. But in order to get Medicaid funding, you had to cover up to 133% of poverty level. The Supreme Court struck that down because Medicaid had been going on for so long, since it had been part of the healthcare system since the mid-60s. The Supreme Court felt that it was a threat by the federal government to the states that if they did not expand Medicaid, they would remove that funding. And since that funding had been in place so long, they felt it was an unconstitutional coercion by the federal government to try and get the states to do what the federal government wanted the states to do. Now, the federal government has used tactics like this to try and get the states to do what they feel like they want the states to do. The federal government, in our federal system, cannot force the states to do a number of things. They may have some national policy, but the states still control a lot of the powers, or have a lot of authority. So the national government, to try and get the states to comply with what they want the states to do, they will offer a carrot, essentially. They'll say, listen, we want to build an interstate highway system. Federal government can't go in there and build roads through states. But if you work with us to build this highway system, we will pay for it. The federal government ended up paying 90% of the cost to build a highway system. And the states, of course, would jump at that because that's economically a very good thing for the states to do. Expanding Medicaid economically would be a very good thing for the states to do because they'd be getting more money coming into the state, which would be a boost to the state's economy. But for various political reasons, a lot of states didn't want to expand Medicaid, and the Supreme Court decided that the expansion of Medicaid was less a gift to the states because the federal government was going to pay 100% of the Medicaid until 2016, and then the Medicaid funding by the federal government would slowly be decreased until 2022, at which time the federal government would pay 90% of the cost of expanding Medicaid. And it would pay 90% from there on out. Supreme Court saw that, again, not as a sort of carrot, but as a coercive, unconstitutional coercion of state governments and state authority. So they struck that part of the law down. Now, what the Supreme Court had to do was decide how central that Medicaid expansion was to the overall Affordable Care Act. If the Supreme Court decided the Affordable Care Act would not work without the Medicaid expansion, they could then use that as an excuse or as a justification to strike the entire Affordable Care Act as unconstitutional not being in force anymore. That means the ban the Affordable Care Act puts on insurance companies from discriminating against people because of pre-existing conditions would go away. The law that, or the part of the law that allows children to stay on their parents' insurance until they turn 26 would go away. The pay, or the amount that the insurance companies can charge men versus women, that they can't charge men and women different price, that would go away. But the Supreme Court decided that Medicaid expansion was not an essential part of the law that would cause the rest of the law to crumble if that was taken away, so they left the rest of the law in place. And I think you can see why that would maybe be an issue that the court would have to look at. If they strike down part of law as unconstitutional, the court then also has to look at, will the rest of the law be effective? Will the law create a lot of problems without that provision? And if it will create problems, the court's just going to go ahead and get rid of the entire law. In this case, they decided that the Affordable Care Act could survive, could do what it was supposed to do without the Medicaid expansion, so they kept it in place. As for the EPA ruling, as we said, the EPA during the Bush administration was refusing to regulate greenhouse gas emissions, specifically carbon dioxide, as some people thought it was required to under the Clean Air Act. The Clean Air Act states that the EPA must regulate any air pollution from new motor vehicles that has an adverse impact on human health and welfare. Welfare being, or including, things like weather and climate. And as we said, climate change, human-caused climate change is something that within the scientific community has not been an issue for the past 30-ish years. What year is it? Yeah, right around 30 years. It's universal, like, it's accepted, it's real, it's happening, and we know what the consequences will be of climate change, and there isn't necessarily a lot of dispute about that either. We know what sea level rise will be, we know what effect on species will be, we know how not what specific weather will be at any specific time, but we know how weather events will become more likely or less likely, and how storms may become more intense or less intense, on average, over an average period. These things are not in dispute. The question there was, and the EPA didn't dispute that all that was scientific fact. They said, yes, all this is true. The EPA, though, claimed administrative discretion, which is also what we look at in the bureaucracy section. The EPA said that we have policy discretion to not regulate CO2 because of economic issues, international treaty issues. We don't think it's a good idea, etc., etc. The Supreme Court looked at the law, looked at the legislative history of the law, and ruled on the side of Massachusetts that the EPA was required by the Clean Air Act to regulate CO2. This was in 2007. We've slowly gotten some of those regulations in place, and they're not really going to take effect. A couple of them have taken effect, but we're looking more 2017. The EPA is giving, like car companies and such, time to adjust to what the regulations will be, as you might expect they would. So in that case, the court said, yes, there's administrative discretion, but we're looking at this and you're not using your administrative discretion properly. It's not, you can't be doing what you're doing. The law specifically requires you to do this and force the EPA to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. So that's the judicial branch. Looking at the federal budget and bureaucracy. Okay. Just I guess a couple of takeaways. Bureaucracy is normally looked at as kind of a dirty word. As I said in class, there's the do you want a government bureaucrat coming between you and your doctor? The important thing to remember about this is that bureaucracies are everywhere, and everything, like business-wise, even our bureaucracy. So the federal government's a bureaucracy, EPA is a bureaucracy, the government of North Carolina is a bureaucracy, Health and Human Services, these are all bureaucracies. Blue Cross Blue Shield is a bureaucracy. The Guilford County School Board's bureaucracy, Guilford Technical Community College is a bureaucracy, AT&T is a bureaucracy. What are good companies people like? Google is a bureaucracy. Do people like Google still? I don't know. So all these things are bureaucracies, and all of these bureaucracies have bureaucrats that are setting rules and regulations for how things will be run within the bureaucracies and how those bureaucracies interact with outside agents. Within the federal government, they come under a lot of scrutiny because oftentimes the bureaucracies are putting regulations on other corporations, and a lot of businesses don't really like regulations, or they prefer to be able to do things more their own way. And so the government bureaucracies will get criticized a lot for that. However, when you go to Verizon and you're denied, I don't know, like a phone upgrade, when they won't offer you insurance for a phone or something, when you go to your doctor and your doctor says you need this medication, but Blue Cross Blue Shield says they're not going to pay for it, those are also bureaucrats making decisions that regulate your life, and regulate everybody's life. So bureaucrats are everywhere. They're necessary. They're great. Somebody who's in a bureaucratic program, I must say, bureaucrats are experts in specific fields, and they're designed to make things move more efficiently and cheaply and such. A lot of people complain about government bureaucrats, that they cannot be fired, for example. They're a waste on taxpayer money. We often hear of the bureaucrat that is lazy and doesn't do any work, and this, that, and the other. Of that political argument, my personal opinion of what I feel like the evidence has shown is that that's largely a smoke screen to attack the bureaucratic system to begin with, to make government or make political arms of the government more able to force the bureaucratic part of government to do what it wants to do. So we enacted these tenure, what's called tenure. It protects bureaucrats from being fired without just cause. So if I work for the EPA, if the federal government wants to fire me, they have to show a good reason to fire me. They can't just fire me for the sake of firing me or whatever. The reason we did that, though, is because there was a lot of corruption in the system. Politicians would appoint their friends, their political allies, to coveted positions within bureaucratic systems. If a government agency started doing something that a politician didn't like, the politician, the president for the executive branch, would go in there and get rid of anybody that wasn't sort of towing the company line, wasn't doing what the president wanted them to do, would fire them and replace them with people that would be guaranteed to do the will of the president. By enacting these tenure reforms, we allowed bureaucrats to be insulated from those political pressures. So if I'm a member of the EPA, if I'm an environmental scientist for the EPA, and I look at, if I go to a coal power plant and I say, you're putting too much arsenic in the water, we're going to fine you a bunch of money and you're going to have to, do these 3 things to make sure you don't put any more arsenic in the water. That may be something that the president does not like, because they rely on the coal industry for campaign donations and to bring support for elections and things like that. Under the old way of doing things, I could be fired for bringing those fines and bringing those regulations to bear on that coal power plant, if it wasn't politically expedient for the president. Under the new system, it separates the bureaucratic decision making from the politics to some extent. It's obviously not perfect, but it helps separate it to some extent so that people who are experts in a field can make decisions based upon their expertise and not based upon whichever way the political winds are blowing at that time. And the idea is, the hope is that leads to greater efficiency, greater cost savings in the government, and it leads to better decisions. One example that I put in the slides is the debt ceiling. So before, we had a system where the federal government, where the Congress would say, we're going to spend X amount of money for this program. And then Congress would write into the law the specific way they would raise money for that program. So if Congress wanted to spend $100 billion buying 100 fighter jets or something, Congress would then say, we're going to take out a loan from Bank of America for $100 billion. We'll tell them that we want a 3% interest rate on that loan or whatever, and we'll pay it off in 10 years. That's the way things were done before. Under the debt ceiling, what Congress has done, it's still spending money and it's authorizing agencies to spend money, and money's being spent, but the debt ceiling authorizes the Treasury to do whatever it needs to do to pay for that, to pay for Congress's bills. So the Treasury, with financial experts and such, will look around at the financial markets, find the best way to pay for these things, often through deficit spending, by taking out loans, and will do so at the lowest cost to the federal government. They'll, roll loans over into lower interest rates. They'll be able to use the leverage of the federal government to get lower interest rates and to get better terms than Congress, with it not having expertise, would ordinarily not be able to do. So that's tenure reform, and why we have tenure reform, and why we have tenure. Besides the federal government, there are several different ways to measure it. For all intents and purposes, the government has shrunk, the federal government at least has shrunk since the late 1960s, early 1970s. This is in response to the Nixon scandals and Vietnam. The federal government workforce has stagnated and decreased as a percentage of the total workforce in the economy. government spending hasn't increased. It also hasn't necessarily decreased as a percentage of GDP. So we've been leveled off at between like 16 and at most 25% is what we've been spending as a percentage of our total gross domestic product. Obviously we're spending less money during boom years and more money during times when the economy is not doing so good. The number of regulations have also decreased that the federal government has. The federal government has been pushing off a lot of the regulations, either eliminating regulations or pushing off to the states for them to do the regulating. So if you just count the number of regulations, the government has decreased, but depending on what you count, how you measure like the scope of the regulations, you could say that it's stagnated or maybe it's increased if you include the state's requirements to regulate or what the states are regulating now. So there's that. We talked about administrative law, what bureaucrats are trying to do. We talked about being more efficient. Frank Goodnow, one of the sort of modern or the administrative law theorists that have helped create modern administrative law, looks at administrators as needing to interpret federal legislation with three priorities in mind: the efficient operation of the people's business. They need to make sure that they're protecting people's rights, and they need to make sure that there's effort to promote, that administrators are there to promote the social welfare. They're not there to restrict people's rights, they're not there to waste money, and they're not there to treat people in a discriminatory fashion or to reduce any sort of social good that's happening in society. So let's look at a budget and get into that. So there's a couple of just facts on here that you can look up on the slides. The federal government will spend approximately $3.5 trillion. It'll take in about $3.0 trillion. $3 trillion in revenue. It takes in most of its money via the income tax. It takes in a very little bit of money via corporate income tax. Since the 50s, corporations and income tax made up roughly the same share of the federal government revenue, but since then, the amount of money that individuals are having to are paying to the federal government, the share of federal government revenue that individuals are accounting for is going up, while the share of federal government revenue that corporations contribute has dropped dramatically. Our federal deficit this year, federal deficit is the difference between the amount of money the government brings in versus the amount of money it spends. If the federal government spends more money in a year than it brings in, that's a deficit. If the federal government brings in more money than it spends, that's a surplus, because there's, it's a profit. You think of it that way. So this year we're looking at a budget shortfall of about $500 billion, which is a lot less than what it's been over the past 5 years. 4.1% or so of GDP, I think. 3% deficit is what it is of GDP, and that's actually pretty good. That's fine if our economy was growing a little faster. So here's what we want to take away from deficit, federal debt, and if we're in trouble or not with regards to deficit and debt. We need to think of deficits and debt as in relation to percentage of the gross domestic product of the nation. What we'll see is the percentage of federal debt we have fluctuate as a percentage of the gross domestic product. When we have economic recessions, what happens to the federal budget is the federal budget increases, the amount of money the federal government spends increases, while the amount of money the federal government brings in decreases. This is because the government has automatic stabilizers in the budget to help stabilize the economy when it starts to, drop off. Those stabilizers are things like unemployment insurance. So government spending just automatically increases. Nothing happens that Congress can do about it. It just automatically increases. Whereas because less people have work and people aren't making as much, the amount that the government brings in tax revenue decreases, which makes the deficit large or larger than it would be ordinarily. Now, what also happens is that part of the definition of a recession is that the economy is shrinking. So what was once a $17.7 trillion gross domestic product becomes a $17.5 trillion gross domestic product, or a $17.3 trillion. You see that the amount of money our economy is producing is decreasing. So while deficits are increasing, and those deficits are adding to the debt, as those numbers are increasing, the other thing that's happening is the total amount of economic output we have is also decreasing, which causes the deficits and debt in relation to the gross domestic product to shoot up really fast. And that's why we saw from 2008 to now the deficit has increased something like 40% as a relation to gross domestic product. That's now stabilized, and it'll actually decrease some over the next few years before it starts increasing again. But even so, right now we're looking at about, the public holds about 73% of the federal debt. That'll decrease some, and then by about 2022, 2023, that GDP percent held by public, the percentage of debt compared to GDP held by the public is going to be about 74%. So it's not actually going to change much at all, which is a good thing. In terms of being worried about deficits, don't at all be worried about deficits right now. The worry about deficits has, we've been talking about it. It's something that people have been concerned about for the past 30 years. It hasn't been a problem yet. The concern over federal debt and federal deficits is a political tactic to try and get government, or to try and force people to support government reduction in spending, and specifically on social welfare programs. There's a really great great quote from, hopefully people remember what the Office of OMB, Office of Management and Budget, is in the White House. It's sort of like the CBO, Congressional Budget Office. It provides economic analysis to the president. During Reagan's administration, he was looking at a tax cut. There was pretty much in the OMB a 50-50 split. The idea was if the government cut taxes, it would spur economic growth, the economic growth would lead to, even though we cut taxes, would increase the amount of money that the federal government brought in. So even though we were cutting taxes, that cutting taxes and the spurring of economic growth would actually increase the amount of money the federal government took in, being a net good for everybody. That was the stated theory, and that was what people talked about. Within the OMB, though, there was a 50-50 split as to whether or not they would actually think that would happen. A lot of people did not think that would happen. They felt that the tax cuts would just decrease the amount of money the federal government took in. They didn't think the stimulating effect would be very much. Excuse me. The leader, the head of the OMB, though, during that time, said, if that's the case, it doesn't matter. If our tax cuts that we want increase federal revenues because it spurred economic growth, that's a good thing for us. If, however, the tax cuts do not increase federal revenues, in fact decrease federal revenues, that's also a good thing because it'll increase the deficit. And if we increase the deficit, that'll increase our political goal of decreasing government spending, because as we increase the deficit, that'll put more pressure on politicians and on people to tell their politicians to decrease spending to reduce the deficit. So they saw it as a win-win, so they did the tax cuts, and it decreased the amount of money the federal government took in, which led to an increase in pressure to cut federal spending. So I guess the point of that was, it's been something that we've been talking about a long time. We're at a position, though, this is a more unique position, where our total debt to GDP is really high. It hasn't been this high since World War II. And we're in a very, very slow economic recovery. We're in a jobless economic recovery. Our economy is growing. It's growing at a slow pace, but it is growing. But we're not seeing any jobs come back. And so that's really holding down the amount of revenue that the federal government's bringing in. And so that actually has a lot of economists worried about the debt. Now, not about the debt today, and not about the debt tomorrow, not about federal deficits today or tomorrow or in 10 years or in 15 years. But we're looking 20, 25, 30, 40 years out. If the economy doesn't start picking up more, we don't see if we don't see the robust economic growth that we've seen in the past, that deficit or that percentage debt to GDP is going to keep slowly ticking up and up and up. And there are lots of indicators that suggest that that will happen, especially with rising healthcare costs. And that's got people worried, because as that slowly ticks up, once you get to 120%, 140%, 160% debt to GDP, you start looking at you start looking at it costing a lot more money for the federal government to borrow. The cost that the federal government incurs to borrow money becomes higher. The government can't respond to crises the way it was able to during this recession, because it had a low percentage of debt relative to GDP. We could create an inflation problem, because as we look to try and get out of the debt, we could start printing more money to try and spur economic growth so that we can get that deficit down. But by doing that, we can create inflation, which will hurt the economy while we'll get out of debt. It'll hurt the economy, hurt a lot of people, things like that. We're in a very unique position right now where we don't have that inflation worry at all. We have an economic recession. We're having a slow economic growth, but without any jobs going with it. Our debt is still at a manageable level. and we don't have an inflation problem. That's why a lot of economists are not concerned about the debt and deficits, and as a matter of fact suggest that the smart thing to do, the correct thing to do, would be to borrow massive amounts of money right now to get different projects going, to fix our roads, bridges, lay down some high-speed rail track, to renovate our schools, hire teachers, do things like that, invest more money in doing research and researching, medical stuff and technology stuff, because we have this opportunity to borrow a lot of money at a very, very low rate, and we have a lot of room on the inflation scale of things that we can do that without causing massive inflation. And doing that will spur the economic growth. It will pump more money into the economy, get more people hired, and then hopefully, once that economic engine gets going, once the government stimulates the economy and the economy sort of grows and builds on itself, that's when the federal government starts reining back its spending, because the economy is chugging along and growing at a good clip. It doesn't need the federal government anymore to help prop it up and move it forward. So once it starts getting going, the federal government can rein back, can lower its deficits, and we can start getting deficits down to the yearly government deficits down to 1 or 2% of GDP, while the GDP is growing at 3 to 4 to 5% every year, which will bring down that total debt as a percentage of GDP, which will lead to happy times for all. But that's not the way we're going, and our policies of increasing taxes and decreasing spending to bring the short-term deficit issue under control, to lower short-term deficits, is hurting the economy. It's without a doubt reduced economic activity by not a full percentage point, most people suggest, but by 0.5% or so. So think about it: if the economy grew by 2.1% last year, if we hadn't enacted those policies, the tax increases and government spending reductions that causes economic contraction, instead of having just 2.1% growth in the economy, we could have had a 2.6% growth in the economy. And as the economy starts growing, that sort of feeds upon itself, and we're really holding back the economy right now. So that's a little bit about deficits. One thing to remember about federal debt is, in political terms, we talk about it as being a burden on our children, and being a burden on our economy, and we're being immoral because we're saddling our children with these huge debts. But when we look at it in investment terms, we see it as being a good thing. Federal debt as being a good thing. We buy federal debt, we give money to the federal government because it's a good and safe investment. I don't know if anybody else had this happen, but I think it's a fairly common thing. My grandparents, when I was born, bought me $100 treasury note, $100 of U.S. debt. And by the time I turned 18, I got that $100 treasury note, and I was able to go to the bank and cash it in for like $150, $160. I can't remember exactly what it was. They bought that not because they thought they were tanking the economy, but because they were they were passing wealth down to me. So when we take out loans, take out these treasury notes, we're not saddling our children with debt. We're passing wealth down to our children. That's, of course, if it's all done within reason, within certain constraints. But the point is deficits and debt are not inherently a bad thing. So the other big issue is Social Security. A lot of people worried about that. We're looking at raising the retirement age and decreasing Social Security benefits because that'll cause a government debt problem. The truth is that Social Security will never ever, unless the laws change somehow, Social Security will never ever add to the federal deficit or the federal debt, because Social Security is a separate government program funded from a completely separate source. It's funded entirely through those payroll taxes that everybody pays. So we will, roughly 2042 is what we're looking at. That number will, that year will either come sooner or come later depending on how the economy grows or doesn't grow over the next 30 years now or so. But at some point, let's say 2042, the Social Security surplus and the amount of money the Social Security has in savings will run out, and Social Security will not be able to pay the full benefits that it's promised people. This does not mean Social Security is bankrupt in the slightest. All it means is that if we've promised you $100 a month as your Social Security payments, Social Security will not be able to pay that $100 a month. It'll be able to pay $75 a month, and that's what we're looking at. About a 75% obligation is what we'll be able to hold. Now, the way we focused on trying to push that year out longer and making sure that we can fund 100% of the Social Security obligations is by reducing the amount of money that Social Security agrees to pay to people. We're increasing the retirement age and decreasing the amount of money people can get through Social Security. Another way we could do that, though, is by what a lot of people probably don't want to do, increasing taxes. And what I mean by this is right now the Social Security tax is 6%. Right? Yeah, 6%. It's 7.2 for Social Security and Medicare, but 6% of that is the flat tax, essentially. Everybody pays 6% of their income to Social Security, and that is a retirement fund that we're all paying into. Don't think of Social Security as a tax. Think of it as the government making people invest in their own retirement, because if the idea is if we didn't have that, if we didn't make people invest in the retirement, we'd have what we had before, lots of old people homeless and on the street, and the government, that seems to be immoral to force an 80-year-old woman to live under a bridge, right? Like that generally is something people want to avoid. So we've instituted this Social Security program knowing that everybody will need government help at some point, and we're just making sure that people take personal responsibility for themselves through the Social Security program. But that 6% that you pay to Social Security, you only pay that up until $118,000, give or take $1,000. Every year it increases slightly based on inflation. But right now, if you make $118,000 a year, you're paying 6% of that to Social Security. Now, if you make $120,000, that $2,000 you make above the $118,000 threshold is not subject to the Social Security tax. You don't pay that 6% anymore. So people that are really rich, that are making a lot of money every year, are not paying a 6% tax on everything they make. They're only paying 6% on the first $118,000 that they earn. So another proposal is, if we increase the amount of money that is subject to the Social Security tax to $250,000, that would more or less most forecast that look at it, that would eliminate the Social Security shortfall and ensure that Social Security will be able to pay out 100% of its benefits from here for the next 75 years, which is how long we project out things like Social Security. Raising the Social Security taxes and raising the amount of money that's subject to that tax is not unprecedented. Reagan actually did it in the mid-'80s, increased it from 4% to 6% to help save Social Security to prevent that shortfall, which was going to come sooner, but now it's going to come later because of the baby boom. So yes, that's Social Security and its relation to the federal deficit, federal debt. I've talked some about ways the government can stimulate the economy, and we've talked about how tax increases have caused the economy a reduction in economic output, and how spending reductions has also spending reductions has also decreased economic output, or decreased the amount of economic growth we could have had. So what can the government do to stimulate the economy? What can we do within the budget to help the economy grow, to get us out of recessions, to get more people back to work? Basically, the deal is the government runs a deficit. It stimulates the economy because that is the government pumping more money into the economy. When the economy is losing money, if it's losing like it did, something like $600 billion in gross domestic product, the government made up for that amount of money so that it lessened the impact. So the things the government can do is, if the government just cuts taxes, doesn't decrease spending but just cut taxes, that will have a stimulating effect on the economy. That will help spur economic output. Now, here are the things with the tax cuts. They are the least effective way to stimulate the economy. They do stimulate the economy, but they're the least effective way to do it. They deliver the less or the least amount of bang for the buck. And just put my foot in a massive puddle here. Tax cuts for the rich stimulate the economy less than tax cuts for the poor. The reason why is because when you give somebody that makes $20,000 a year a tax cut, they're going to spend all that money, which will stimulate the economy. If you give somebody that makes $2 million a year a tax cut, they're not going to spend all that money. They're going to save some of it. It's not going to go into the economy. It'll just go into, some kind of investment or savings account, and that will not grow the economy. But tax cuts, generally, we think of them having for every dollar we spend in tax cuts, we have a $1.30 return in $1.30 return in economic output. What is the best way to stimulate the economy? What government program, what can the government do that provides the greatest bang for the buck in terms of producing economic growth? That would be unemployment insurance. Unemployment insurance, for every dollar we spend on unemployment benefits, we see between $1.80 to $2 increase in economic activity in our GDP. So if we have $17.7 trillion right now is our GDP. If the federal government spends $100 billion this year for unemployment insurance, the $100 billion itself will increase our GDP to $17.8 trillion. However, because of the compounding stimulating effects that money will have on the economy, we'll actually see our GDP grow to approximately $17.9 trillion. So we get that extra boost. And that's why a lot of economists are very critical of the federal government's decision to cut unemployment benefits and to reduce those or eliminate those long-term unemployment benefits, because that's essentially just shooting ourselves in the foot, because that's has been one of the major programs that has kept things from getting really terrible. Luckily, the economy is growing right now, and cutting the unemployment insurance isn't going to send us into a recession, or at least it doesn't look like it will send us into a recession, because we're seeing enough economic growth. But it will, without a doubt, slow the economic growth. It will slow the economic recovery. It'll increase the amount of time that people are unemployed, decrease the amount of jobs that are available for people, so it'll make it harder for people to find jobs, and instead increase the amount of time those people stay unemployed. So that's economy stuff, how the budget, how the deficit and debt work in the economy, what some of the policy positions are and policy issues are with that. And I'll end there. Next week we have an exam, and we'll be going over a little bit of this material on Monday, and then basically we'll spend the rest of the week answering questions, talking about the study guide I handed out to everybody. So hope that was helpful for somebody, and have a good weekend.